Greetings and welcome back to Nerdy Nonfiction with Conlon Sinclair. As always, I'm your host, Conlon Sinclair. Links to my books are in the YouTube description, so if you're interested in what I'm talking about, you might be interested in what I'm writing about. I'd first like to offer an apology for the shambles of last week's podcast between my yawning and stuttering and the clock going off. It was a mess. Luckily this week I am well rested and coming to you with a full pot of coffee in my hand. So let's get started. Today's episode is about competing theories, or places where there are multiple theories that could explain a mystery of some kind. Both these mysteries are technically in the realm of mythology, but they are quite different, and the theories we will be listening to are also quite different. I trust that you are all familiar with the story of the Selkie. The Selkie is a type of fairy believed to live in northern Europe, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Ireland, the Hebrides in Scotland, sometimes on Shetland and Orkney, also in Scotland. A Selkie is a seal maiden, a type of fairy who is usually female, who turns from human to seal, much like a werewolf. But instead of a full moon, it is when they have the seal skin, which upon putting it on, they transform into a seal. This is a very popular myth. It is sadly probably the most popular myth in Scotland. There are so many great Scottish myths, and as a Scot, it pains me to know that the Selkie is what represents us on the world stage of mythology. But that's life. There are a lot of competing theories on where Selkies came from. The most popular theory, which I personally think is the weakest and one of the most ridiculous, is that the story of the Selkie originates with contact between the Norse and the Inuit on Greenland. The idea goes that Inuit women in their seal skin kayaks are the inspiration for the seal maidens in the Selkie myth. The bridal kidnappings of Inuit women by Danish men is the origin of the myth, and of course these kidnapped women eventually escaped and made it back to their tribes, luckily. The result of this period of apparent wide-scale rape is that we've got this myth of the Selkie. I think that's utterly ridiculous. There's no evidence of large-scale amounts of Inuit heritage on modern Scots, modern Irish, people in Greenland. Of course, are all Inuit for the most part, with very little Norse heritage that comes from anything other than the modern period. So I think that's just ridiculous. It is, of course, possible that Inuit hunters could have made it from Greenland across Iceland and all the way to Scotland. That, of course, happened in the past. Several Inuit men were captured in raids by Scottish clans. One was taken to Edinburgh and died there as a prisoner. The story behind this has certainly been lost. We do know there was some contact between very, very lost Inuit hunters who took their canoes to Europe and the populations of Europe, but we're dealing with a myth that is entirely about marriage and the interbreeding between populations. And I don't think, frankly, that the Scots were racist enough to think that Inuit women were non-human to the point that they were seal maidens. I think that's pretty ridiculous. So let's really try to discount that. I talked in the pilot episode about the idea of elves as Neanderthals. And just like people have said that elves are Neanderthals, people have said that the Selkies were originally Neanderthals. A very great writer who wrote an entire article on this talked about how the Arctic Circle back during the Ice Age would have been much lower than it was today. It would have probably been about where Normandy is. And that humans coming up from the south would have encountered tribes of Neanderthals who lived on the ocean, hunting seals, hunting whales in primitive boats, and they would have been different, very different than the humans. These Neanderthal tribes very well might have had adaptations for a semi-aquatic environment. Obviously, they wouldn't have been semi-aquatic in the sense of being, full-on mermen in reality. But, skin doesn't fossilize. And a lot of people in modern times consider the mark of somebody with Selkie blood to be somebody with webbed hands. It's entirely possible that Neanderthals had that mutation at a higher rate than we do. If they were living, some parts of their kind were living in the Arctic Circle, hunting whales and seals, as they probably were. It wouldn't be surprising that such a trait would have become dominant. So this is an interesting idea. It's one that I think has a little bit more credence than the idea of large-scale bridal kidnapping from the Inuit. But there are still a lot of problems with this. The Selkie myth is very much contained to Scandinavian and Gaelic Europe. Islands, entirely islands. This is not a myth found on mainland Scotland. It is a myth found in islands. The Arctic Circle was considerably lower back during the Ice Age, and much of the area which the Selkie myth is told would have been under mountains and mountains of glacial ice. The people living in what is now Normandy back in the Ice Age are probably not the same people living in Iceland today. There have been lots of population movements since then. We actually don't have any idea who the people of Ice Age Europe were, if they have any genetic continuity with modern Europeans. We have no idea. Some people say yes, some people say no. Some people say Indo-European culture started in Russia, and some say it started in France, and some say it started in Denmark. We're never going to know these things. But Neanderthals as Selkies. Possible, imaginative, unlikely. We've got two theories now that are unlikely. So, what is a likely explanation? Well, a likely explanation is that there have always been seal fairies in Celtic mythology. Celtic mythology is loaded with animal fairies. We've got cat fairies, deer fairies. There's a magical salmon that the hero Finn eats to gain awareness of the cosmos. Animals are a big part of Celtic mythology. That might be a holdover from before the Indo-European conquest of Ireland. It's unclear. But the idea of seal fairies is probably very old. The original myth probably did have to do with a marriage and the wife returning to sea, but probably in a completely different context than the story told originally. It might have even been the background of the birth of a hero whose exploits are now lost. Do you have any idea how many Knights of the Round Table there are? And every single one of them was probably a Celtic hero of some regional importance during the Iron Age. There probably was some regional Celtic hero of the Hebrides whose parent was a seal fairy, just like the hero Ossian's parent was a deer fairy, and we're never going to know these things. I think that is the most logical explanation. Of course, we're never going to know. We will never know. We never know anything. And it is entirely possible that either the Inuit or the Neanderthal theory is correct, and I am dead wrong. I am the first to admit that I could be dead wrong because, as you know, we don't know anything. And the man who admits to knowing nothing is on the first step to becoming wise. See, I can be arrogant and humble at the same time. Okay, the second part of our show today is about Sir Orfeo. Sir Orfeo is a very interesting myth. It is sometimes considered a Christian version of the myth of Orpheus from Greek mythology. Orpheus was the heroic prophet bard who is the main prophet of the Orphic religion, which was a religion that existed a long time ago, that has died out many centuries ago, that practiced vegetarianism and believed in reincarnation. It has a lot of very superficial parallels to Buddhism and comes out of the same Indo-European school of thought. But the story of Sir Orfeo is found in Scotland, and it is a Christian variant of the Orpheus myth in which there's a happy ending. Orpheus saves his wife and lives happily ever after. But to say it's a Christianization is not entirely accurate. It is a Celticization of the myth. It is a Celtic version of the myth that is specific to a Celtic worldview. The villain is not the god of the dead. The villain is the fairy king, the king of the other world. This is certainly not Christian. It is entirely Celtic pagan in origin. And it has really nothing to do with Christian theology whatsoever. So we've got a Celtic version of a Greek myth, basically. Where does something like that come from? Well, obviously, England was part of the Roman Empire. And the Romans practiced a sort of bastardized form of Greek religion. We know that the interpretation Romano was a way for the Romans to co-opt local religion. Local gods were insisted by the Roman authorities to be variants of Greek gods or Roman gods so that the Romans were the dominant force. The local priests were forced to say that their gods and the Roman gods were the same gods. This has happened numerous times over the former Roman Empire. A very famous story is about the usurper to the Roman throne who worshipped a variant of Hercules, who was Hercules Germanicus, the German Hercules. And a lot of people have looked into this and thought this is very strange. Why is there a German Hercules? And there are two ways we can look at this. One is due to the interpretation Romano. Thor is being called Hercules. Thor and Hercules, of course, have a lot of similar attributes. So this usurper might have been a devotee of Thor, which is entirely possible because he was probably a Goth, and the Goths are from Scandinavia. How does this fit into Sir Orfeo? Well, it's entirely possible that a local Celtic hero was absorbed into the Orpheus myth. There are a lot of local Celtic hero bards. Numerous versions of this archetypal hero bard have survived to the present day. There are various gods who are hero bards. The god Lu is a hero bard. The god Agma is a hero bard. Ossian is warrior, hero, prince, bard. There are a lot of heroic Celtic bards, and one of them very easily could have been co-opted into the interpretation Romano and renamed Orpheus. And from there we get a British Orpheus myth, Sir Orfeo. That's entirely possible. The problem is that Sir Orfeo follows the Orpheus myth so closely that there's really little variation that could be put down to a local hero who's been co-opted. In all likelihood, what we're looking at here is that Orpheus is so popular among the Welsh and among the Britons and becomes popular in Scotland with the movement of peoples after the collapse of the Roman Empire, because Orpheus is a miracle-working prophet bard, and there are so many miracle-working prophet bards already in the local consciousness. Excuse me. And because of this, we're left with a single local variant of a Greek myth in Scotland, of all places. There were probably numerous examples of this that have been lost. A lot of minstrels were burned at the stake during the early part of the Middle Ages because their stories were pagan in origin. So there could have been a lot of these. Could there have been this Germanic Hercules? Could he have been a separate figure from Thor? Thor co-opted by the interpretation Romano? Probably, yes, maybe. We also have a good idea that Castor and Pollux from Greek tradition had a Celtic variant where they were the children of the horse goddess Epona. The son of the horse goddess Epona is mostly remembered as Percival, the Arthurian knight. It is entirely possible that Percival is a version of Castor or Pollux, as well as a Celtic figure. We know that the Celtic god Lu was equated with Mercury. There are a lot of stories about Lu. There probably were a lot of stories about Mercury. There are a lot of French Mercury temples that were originally sacred places of Lu. The same thing would have happened in Egypt, in the Middle East. There were lots of these stories, and we're never going to know what any of them are because it has been lost to time. However, as an author, I think this is very fertile ground for some good fantasy stories to be written as the lost epics of the world. So I challenge you, my listeners, if you're also authors, to write some version of a Greek myth in some local Roman locality. It should be a fun challenge. And I'm sorry again about my clock going off. I can't do anything about the clock, people. I'm very sorry. It is entirely unprofessional of me that this clock goes off during every podcast, but that's what the clock does. It is an heirloom from my grandmother, and I cannot figure out for the life of me how to work it. I need a clock specialist. Anyway, let's have a good laugh about that, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.